Hello, my name is Adrian Almanza, and I am continuing on the historical perspective with the Victorian era. Now, I want you to remember that during the Victorian era, it was a strict period for women and for men, but mainly for women. And here's why. Because men were able to set the morality aside. Now, though they had a strict code of conduct, because they were emotionally and sexually disconnected from women, they were able to set the morality aside and seek out women who were not their wives and have sex with them, which were known as prostitutes. And this is during this time, this is when prostitution flourished, which was ironic because women were held to a strict conduct. During this time also, men could smoke, they could drink, they could joke, and like I mentioned before, find sexual companionship with women who turned to prostitution for money. Now, if you look at this, men still at this time had much more freedom than women. If a woman was caught doing this, they were shamed, they were shunned, but a man could still get away with it. Now, at the turn of the 19th century, there were sexual contradictions. Now, here's why. If you remember on the previous slide, women were held to the image of Madonna or Eve. Now, during this period, their sexuality was polarized between the images of Madonna and a whore. Such a huge contrast. And men still trapped between the ideal of purity and frank pleasures of sexual expression. The difference? Women were held to a higher regard or were more highly criticized than men were. Now, at the 20th century, there was a shift in perspectives of sexuality. Now, it's important to note that physician Havlik Ellis wrote a book on life and sex during the 1920s. And now in his book, he emphasized the love rights of women. And this book basically talked about how women were also experiencing sexual pleasure and not just men. And in the book Studies in the Psychology of Sex regarded any sexual practices which introduced homosexuality is healthy as long as no one was harmed. Now, this is interesting because homosexuality was still frowned upon, but with this book being published, it was talking more about how homosexuality can actually be accepted, as long as no one was harmed. Now, in 1920, that's when the 19th Amendment was created, and it guaranteed women the right to vote. So now women are beginning to develop more rights. They're beginning to be looked at as having a little bit of power. However, there was still no equality between them and men. And during World War I, this was a time period when there was an increase in equality and flexibility of gender roles. Why? Because men had to leave because they were enlisted in war, and so somebody had to do the jobs that men now had. And so the women took those roles, they left their traditional house life, and were able to go and fill in the roles of men and get paid for them, for those positions. And of course, you have the movies. Who doesn't love movies? During this time when movies were created, there was more romance and sex symbols. And who do you think the sex symbols were? Women. Which then led to flappers. Now, flappers, you can think of them as rebellious type of people. Why? Because during the Victorian age, women had to wear corsets and had to show their purity and their beauty. And during this time, this was more the young, urban, single, middle-class women who rejected the ideals of Victorian restraint. And they decided to wear short, slinky dresses, and some of them would smoke, some of them would drink, and basically be deviant. And then we have the sexual revolution. Now, the definition of sexual revolution is a series of changes that occurred during a couple of decades in the mid-20th century, especially regarding ideals and values about sex and love. So it's important to note that values and behaviors had changed during this time. In 1965, the Supreme Court had legalized contraceptives for married couples. And in 1972, unmarried couples could have contraceptives. I didn't even know something like that had happened in America. And gays and lesbians openly declared sexual orientation. And so during this time period, if you before 1973, if you were gay or lesbian, it was considered a disorder. But now in 1973, it was passed that it was no longer a disorder. And of course, in our mass media, as it is today, there was an increased openness about sexuality. And in movies and in films and TV shows, there was more incorporation of gays and lesbians. And of course, who can forget about the Super Bowl halftime in 2004, where Janet Jackson had a mishap and was highly criticized. Even the media was criticized for their slack of sexuality and just allowing something like this to happen on TV, which Janet Jackson had her breasts shown all over the media. And of course, pornography business grossed over $10 billion a year.